Hi students, so in this part of the video lecture I want to talk a little bit about licensing, how software licenses are used. This is an important part of Linux software development because we've already talked about some of the freedoms that you're granted and some of the ability that you have based on the access to the source. So what the licensing tells you are your obligations based on being granted those freedoms. And there are different types of software licensing. We'll go over some of the different types. And then we'll talk about the licenses that are specifically used often with Linux development and talk about how to contribute to the open source Linux software. So you may have heard the expression about free as in freedom, not free as in beer. And so the word free is sort of overloaded in the English language. You can be talking about freedom, like your abilities not being restricted, your abilities to do things, you're being free to do something. Or you can talk about things not having any cost. And so that's the free as in beer, where if someone's giving away free beer, what they mean is they're not going to charge you any money to get the beer. And so what we talk about when we're talking about licensing for Linux, we're talking about the first definition of free, the free as in freedom. So you have the freedom to obtain and you have the freedom to modify the source code as long as you follow the stipulations in the license. There are two basic categories of licensing for open source software. And the first is what we'll refer to as permissive licenses. So in other words, these are licenses that give you the freedom to obtain and modify the source code with relatively few limitations that you have based on your modifications to that source code. Two examples of permissive licenses that you'll see on open source software are BSD, which stands for Berkeley Software Distribution, and MIT, which stands for Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So these are original software licenses that came about from each one of these academic institutions during the early days of open source software development. And the basic premise of permissive licenses is that you can use the code, you can modify the code, and you don't necessarily need to share those modifications or the source code that you incorporate them into with your customers if you're developing an embedded Linux device. So this is important in some scenarios because if you're working for a company and they're developing their own proprietary intellectual property, you wouldn't want to necessarily restrict the company in the way that would make them need to share all the details of their intellectual property as a part of using some software library. So on the other side of permissive licensing is what's called copyleft licensing, and it's kind of a play on the word copyright, where what it's saying is that if you incorporate this licensed material into your work, with some limitations, you typically need to share the content of the overall system that you're building based on that work. So two examples, or the main example of the copyleft license that's used with Linux is the GPL or the GNU public license. And so what does this mean? It means that if you use the GPL and you use GPL licensed software, your customers that buy your product, and by virtue of the open nature of the internet, essentially you'd need to plan on everyone, would get access to the source code if the source code that you developed is what's considered a derivative work. So the definition of derivative work involves maybe more legal terms than we're going to be able to cover in this course. But what it really means is if you're modifying an application that's GPL licensed, you're going to have to share the content of those modifications in order to comply with the license terms. So here's an example of a permissive license, in this case an MIT license. So, and this shows some of the typical things that you'll see in a software license. So first it goes over your rights as a user of the software. So some of the things to look for here: I can modify the software, I can distribute the software, I can sell the software. So this is telling me all the things that I can do as a user of this software. And then this tells me what, if I'm going to use the software per the terms of the license, what do I have to do? And in this case, what it says is the above copyright notice and the permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of the software. So I need to make sure that I include the copyright information that's associated with the license, say who developed this software, and I need to pass on the permission notice that is given here in this document. And then it also covers the limitation as a user that you need to pass on to your users as well for the use of the software. And the basic, non-legal layman's description of this is, if it doesn't work, don't sue me, right? So what this is saying is that the copyright holder is letting you use it for whatever purpose you want, as long as you give them attribution in the form of notifying that you're using their copyright, and as long as you free them from liability and you pass that along to your customers to let them know that the original they can't go back and sue the original copyright holder if there's something doesn't work in the software. Two examples of licensing that are used in Linux software development that are of the copyleft variety are LGPL and GPL. So LGPL is typically used for software libraries, so for instance GCC libraries, and these allow you to link to a proprietary application without needing to share the source code of your application. So you see this used for things like GCC libraries. This allows you to build your software with GCC, call something like printf, and not have to worry about having licensing restrictions apply to your application that you built based on that call to a library that's included as part of GCC. But what it does say is that if you needed to make some change to a printf function or to something that's a part of the GCC library, you would be legally obligated to share that change with when you distribute the ultimate application. So for GPL-based software, like what is used for the Linux kernel, GPL, as I mentioned before, is considered a copyleft license. In other words, if you incorporate in any way the source code of that GPL licensed software into your software is also bound by terms of the GPL, meaning that you would need to distribute its source code to customers. There are different versions of the GPL, however. You'll see that referenced in GPL version 2 versus version 3. The TiVo that we mentioned earlier as being one of the first Linux hardware devices did some changes which meant that they could meet the spirit of the GPL, or meet the requirements of the GPL version 2 by publishing all their source code, but not allow the customer to modify the source code and then run it on their hardware. So they put some restrictions in hardware, which meant that their hardware could only run the specific Linux binary that they created, and not something else that would be created by someone else using their source code as a reference. And there was some consternation in the community about whether that was an appropriate and valid use of the license. And so part of the newest revision of GPL, or GPL v3, specifically prevents that use case. In other words, it says that not only must you share all your source, but you also must not restrict the ability of the user to change the source and run it on your hardware. However, importantly, the Linux kernel has not incorporated GPL version 3, so the kernel still uses the version 2 of the license that allows the type of implementation that TiVo did, that shares the source code, but does not necessarily make it possible for customers to update with their own source code on your device. So what do we mean when we talk about contributing to open source community? And what are some of the things that go into contributing open source software? I mentioned before that there are groups that are associated with each software application in terms of Linux application development. There's groups that are associated with each specific subcomponent of the Linux kernel. And contributing to open source for those groups typically means that you're going to be communicating with others, probably in written fashion, and most likely over open forums. So you're going to be using things like mailing lists to interact with a bunch of people that have some stake in the development of whatever software you're talking about. So this means that you're going to need to be responding to questions about your code. You're going to need to ask good questions when you need help from others. And you're going to have to follow detailed and specific submission rules about how to submit changes for whatever project you happen to be trying to contribute to. And I want you to think about making open source contributions, especially as a part of your final project, and how you could maybe leverage that in terms of advertising your own skills. So this is the kind of thing that you should be able to ultimately put on your resume, the fact that you contributed to some open source project. And as I mentioned before, each project has their own rules about how to contribute. And so if you want to see the type of detail that's included in this, here's a link to how to contribute to the Linux kernel that you can use for more information about that.